My Life with Doc by Dr. Peter Shields. First published in Leipoldt's Cellar and Kitchen in 2005. What follows was based on a recorded conversation between Trevor Emsley and Dr. Peter Shields in the latter's home in Berkhamsted, just north of London, in August 2003. Dr. Shields had said that he was not a writer and that he did not feel able to write about the time he spent growing up in Dr. C. Louis Leipoldt's household. He was perfectly happy, however, for their conversation to be recorded and for extracts therefrom to be written up by Trevor Emsley for publication in Leipoldt's Cellar and Kitchen, subject to his approval. Dr. Shields approved the following account of his life with Dr. C. Louis Leipoldt. I was 12 years of age when, in 1930, I went to live with Leipoldt at his house, Arbery, in the Cape Town suburb of Kenilworth. Doc, as we called him, had an adopted son, Jeff, a few years younger than me, and the three of us lived together until Jeff and I went off to fight as volunteers in World War II. Although I have now lived for the past 25 years in England, where I was born, my impression is that most South Africans think of Leipoldt as an Afrikaans poet, but do not know enough to appreciate the many other sides of this versatile man. Doc was very liberal for his time. He was also great fun and was very, very mischievous. You never quite knew whether he was pulling your leg. It was always a problem to know whether or not to take him seriously. For instance, I remember him telling us that in China it was considered a delicacy to take a live baby mouse by the tail, dip it in honey, put it in your mouth, and let it scamper down your throat. Doc claimed to be a Buddhist. I think he needed to break free of the dictates of his strict Protestant upbringing, remembering that his father had been the dominee of the Dutch Reformed Church in Clanwilliam, and that he never went to school. He was taught by his father and could recite long extracts from the Bible. We didn't go to church. Doc wasn't against organized religion. He just wasn't interested in it. Doc played a lot of tennis. I remember that Mr. Justice van Zyl often came to tennis on Sundays. We had a court at Arbery, and that his daughter was a very good tennis player. Doc did no running on court, but was nevertheless an effective and dangerous player. He would stand there and place his lobs with great skill. He was brilliant at billiards, and he played a great deal of bridge, often with Mrs. Bolus. I think the Boluses were like family to him. He must have been a very good bridge player, as he had a formidable memory. Doc had no dress sense whatsoever. I remember going swimming with him at St. James's Pool, and his swimwear was so ghastly that Jeff and I didn't want to be seen near him. He probably didn't care. One Saturday evening, he ventured forth in a dinner jacket, with his bow tie so unbelievably skew that I instinctively went up to him to straighten it. He stopped me, saying, "Don't. They won't recognize me if you do that." For many years, we didn't have a wireless at Arbery. Doc wouldn't allow it. But in 1937, he suddenly went out and bought a very large one. He would sit and listen to Adolf Hitler's speeches, getting very angry. Of course, he could understand German, whereas the rest of us couldn't. We spoke mainly English at home, and Doc actually did a lot of his writing in English. He wrote several poems in English that were published under the pseudonym Pheidippides. I would say that about half of Doc's friends who visited the house were English-speaking, and the other half Afrikaans. We used to go for wonderful trips in the countryside, and one always met lots of interesting people in his company. I remember visiting General Smuts on his farm at Irene outside Pretoria, and thinking that his wife, Oma Smuts, was the maid. So unpretentious was she. We often visited General Smuts. Doc loved Clan William and the Cederberg, and went there fairly often. They were his spiritual home. He knew a terrific number of people in that part of the world, and wherever he went, he would call on friends. Doc would always sing while he drove. He would tease me about the Irish Republican song, the one about hanging men and women for wearing the green, and he would often sing this song while driving. He wasn't really musical, but he loved church music and would go to church to listen to the musical performances. After the war, Doc didn't drive much, and he gave me his car when I was demobilized and returned to Cape Town after the war. Occasionally he would borrow it to go off botanizing, and it was always filthy when he returned it. Doc used to tell wonderful ghost stories, especially when we were out camping. Of course, he would tell them at night, just before we went to bed. They were always made up on the spot. I particularly remember one about people being poisoned by mushrooms and about the horrible deaths they died. Needless to say, Doc used to collect mushrooms himself when the opportunity arose. Doc did not cook on an everyday basis. He employed a cook for this purpose. One cook he employed just before the war was a German woman, and I remember that we gave her quite a hard time. I didn't then give much thought to the food we ate, and while I can say that we always ate extremely well, I cannot say that it was particularly exotic. Doc cooked himself whenever he gave a dinner party, which he did fairly often. There were always interesting people at his dinner parties, and Jeff and I were always included. Doc loved arguing. He would have made a great lawyer. He was also a great talker, continually asking questions, usually pulling your leg. He would suddenly decide to give you a hard time, and then the temporary verbal assault would begin. He loved to present you with an alternative view of whatever point you were making, even if you were merely stating a fact. There were rules in the house, but Jeff and I were never afraid of Doc. He instituted a sort of prefect system with older boys, usually medical students, looking after us, as he was often away lecturing at the University of Cape Town Medical School in the evenings. He instituted a black book system, something I think he had picked up at a rugby school in England. 5 black marks meant a hiding, but Doc wasn't really a disciplinarian, and the hiding never materialized. Where he was strict was on one's attitudes to people. If Jeff or I commented disparagingly on other people, he would always say, "Don't be such a snob." Doc had worked as a medical inspector of schools in England, and he held a high opinion of English public schools. He approved of them. He would say to Jeff and me that we really ought to be at school at rugby in England. He did get fed up with us at times. For instance, if one of us trod on one of his best flowers, then he would storm off in anger, but generally he was very even-tempered. Doc would set Jeff and I exams, approximately once a month. He didn't test what we knew, but set us tasks to find out and discover things before the next exam. In retrospect, I think this was very worthwhile. I think Doc was reasonably comfortably off, but not wealthy. He left cash of about £20,000 in his estate, and Jeff and I each inherited some £10,000. I was the executor of his literary estate, and in this capacity I assigned the copyrights owned by his estate to the University of Cape Town when I left South Africa in 1978. Doc always had wine with his meals, and Jeff and I were always given wine. Doc used to make us describe it, something I wasn't much good at. He considered wine to be a good thing, and we all enjoyed it. My recollection is that Doc's preference was for red wine. He was never snobbish about wine, or about anything else for that matter. I never saw him tight. He seldom had more than 2 glasses of wine. Doc would have loved to see the current state of development of South African wine, which was still very ordinary in the 1940s, and he would no doubt be pleased to know that I remain very fond of wine in the 21st century. Doc used to come home with his medical bags stuffed with books, having stopped off at the library on his way. He was a very fast reader and would borrow about 5 books at a time, often reading all of them in one night. Sometimes he would toss one at me, saying as it flew through the air, "Here, this might interest you." He had many books. One wall of his study was lined with them. These he bequeathed to the South African Library. Many people seem to think that Doc was or might have been homosexual. I must say that I cannot see that it matters, but if he was, we never saw anything of it at all. Not a hint. Of course, one didn't discuss such things in those days. At any rate, not in the way people do nowadays, but quite frankly, the possibility never crossed our minds, and I am absolutely certain that there was nothing like that at all in our household. There is no question of it being otherwise. It is true that he didn't have much to do with women, except women friends of long standing. And he didn't have women in the house, except our German cook. I remember him kicking up a fuss when her daughter came to stay, but I imagine that had more to do with us. He was afraid one of us might get her into trouble. Doc had a Huguenot painting of a French woman hanging on his wall at Arbery. He found it stuffed behind a couch at Nudia's house and said to Nudia, "Do you want this?" Nudia asked him whether he would like it. It now hangs on my wall and I love it. Doc used to refer to the woman in the painting as the lady of the house. On the subject of the Anglo-Boer War, my impression is that towards the end of the war, Doc had blotted his copybook, so to speak, in the eyes of the British. He was reporting on the war from the Boer side, and he had annoyed the military authorities. I think it was important for him to leave Cape Town when he did, or he would have landed in trouble. Oom Gert Vertel and other poems dealing with the war were, I think, based on real incidents. I imagine that living in England must have changed Doc's attitude to the English, whom, until then, during the war, he had every reason for regarding as the enemy. A lot of things Doc said were taken up the wrong way. For example, the controversy over his statement that it would be better for school children to be given wine than milk. At the time, milk was dished out to school children in mugs, and it was often contaminated. This was the context of his remarks about wine being better for school children than milk. I was at medical school after my return from the war when they called me out of a lecture with the news that Doc had had a heart attack. I went straight to see him and visited him every day until his death about 5 days later. I used to take him books. I think he sensed that the end was nigh, for he said to me, "I see little goblins. They've come for me." He always used to joke about goblins or little somethings or other. "Oh, nonsense," I replied, but he died that night. I greatly enjoyed living in Doc's home, and I learned an immense amount from him. Thinking back, I was exceedingly fortunate. I had lost my own father, also a doctor, who died in 1925, and whom I adored. But Doc stepped in and provided me with a good, wholesome, easy childhood. And yes, I loved him. He was like a big bear with a somewhat gruff voice. I always think of him as a big bear. Doc was happiest, I think, when he was out in the veld botanizing.